Wilhelmina Hawkins had been left at the altar 3 times, and every single man in Caldwell, Kansas, knew exactly why. She simply refused to lie. The town of Caldwell in the autumn of 1878 was a place that hummed with the particular energy of a cattle town perched on the edge of the Kisham Trail, where drovers brought longhorns north from Texas and spent their wages with enthusiastic carelessness before turning back south. It was a town of saloons and mercantile shops, of a newly built church with a crooked steeple, of wide, dusty streets that turned to rivers of mud whenever the rains came down from the north. And it was a town that had, over the course of 3 painful, spectacularly public ceremonies, decided that Wilhelmina Hawkins was too much trouble to marry. She was 26 years old, which in Caldwell in 1878 meant the older women clucked their tongues when she walked past, and the younger women looked at her with a curious mixture of pity and secret admiration. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her head, not because she lacked vanity, but because she was always working and loose hair got in the way. Her eyes were the color of good bourbon held up to afternoon light amber with flecks of gold, and they had a directness to them that made men uncomfortable, because those eyes never looked away first, and they never pretended to see something other than what was there. Her father, Thomas Hawkins, ran the only general store in Caldwell with the tired competence of a man who had survived the war, the migration west, and 3 daughters. 2 of those daughters had married without incident. Wilhelmina was the third. The first man who had left her at the altar was a cattle buyer named Gerald Prout, who had courted her for 4 months and asked her directly, 3 days before the wedding, whether she thought him a handsome man. She had looked at him honestly and said he was not particularly handsome, but that he had a pleasant voice and honest hands, and she thought those qualities worth more than a fine face. Gerald Prout had not appreciated this assessment. He had wanted her to say he was the most handsome man she had ever seen, which would have been a lie so obvious that even the horses would have laughed. She would not say it. He left. The second man was a farmer named Amos Whitfield who had asked her, 2 weeks before their scheduled wedding, whether she thought his plan to drain the eastern meadow and plant winter wheat was a sound one. She had studied the land, consulted her own considerable knowledge of the local soil and drainage patterns, and told him plainly that the eastern meadow sat in a flood basin and would drown his wheat in the first wet spring. Amos Whitfield did not want to hear this. He had already told everyone in town about his winter wheat plan, and having his bride-to-be contradict him publicly felt like a wound to his dignity. He left. The third man was a rancher's son named Boyd Carver, and this one had lasted all the way to the church steps before he turned around. He had asked her, in a whisper while they stood before Reverend Duncan's open door with the whole congregation watching, whether she loved him more than anything. And she had paused, just a small pause, the kind a more calculating woman would have smoothed over with a quick yes. And in that pause she had been composing the truthful answer, which was that she cared for him genuinely and believed they could build a good life together, but that she was not sure the lightning-strike feeling she had read about in novels had arrived for her yet, and she did not think it honest to claim otherwise. Boyd Carver read the pause correctly, turned, and walked back down the church steps without a word. The congregation whispered for 2 weeks. After Boyd Carver, Wilhelmina's father sat her down at the kitchen table and told her, with the weary love of a man who had stopped trying to change her and started trying to manage the consequences, that she might consider softening her delivery. She had poured him coffee, sat down across from him, and said, "Papa, I have watched 3 men walk away rather than hear the truth from the woman they claim to want to marry. I do not think the problem is me." Thomas Hawkins had drunk his coffee and said nothing more about it. The town had its opinions, as towns always do. Martha Greer at the millinery said that Wilhelmina was too proud for her own good. Silas Pemberton, who ran the livery, said she was a fine woman but had the social grace of a circuit judge. The women of the sewing circle debated her case with the thoroughness of a trial, concluding mostly that she should have learned to tell smaller lies, the kind that kept the machinery of social life running smoothly. Only her friend Clara Dunbar, who ran the boarding house with her widowed mother, ever said directly to Wilhelmina's face that she thought the men of Caldwell were simply not equal to the task of being loved honestly. Wilhelmina kept working. She helped her father in the store, keeping the accounts with a precision that saved them from the slow drain of small errors, negotiating with suppliers with a candor that sometimes startled them into better prices. She delivered meals to old Mrs. Perkins, who could not cook anymore since her hands had gone arthritic. She helped the Reverend's wife organize the school fundraiser. She lived, in other words, the full life of a woman who had been told she was too much and had decided to be exactly that much regardless. It was the first week of October 1878 when the stage from Wichita brought Elias Conroy to Caldwell. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was going gold and the dust from the main street hung in the air like something precious. He stepped off the stage in a long canvas duster, coat the color of dried clay, with a hat that had seen considerable weather and boots that had walked a good many miles of difficult country. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who worked with his body but thought with his head, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. His eyes were the particular shade of green-gray that shifts depending on the light, and they moved across the street with the unhurried, methodical attention of someone who had learned to read a place before entering it. He carried one leather bag and a bedroll, which told Clara Dunbar, who happened to be sweeping the boarding house steps when the stage arrived, that he was either very modest in his needs or had recently lost everything. He turned out to be the former. He came directly to the boarding house, asked for a room for 2 weeks to start, paid in advance with money that was neither flashy nor short, and then asked Clara with considerable politeness whether there was a decent meal to be had and where he might find the man who owned the general store. Clara pointed him toward her mother's dinner table, which was set for 6 boarders, and told him Thomas Hawkins's store was 3 buildings north. She mentioned, because she was a curious and friendly woman, that Mr. Hawkins's daughter Wilhelmina usually worked the afternoon shift at the store and was very capable. Elias Conroy thanked her with the kind of genuine courtesy that was different from practiced charm, and went awash the road dust off before dinner. He came to the store that same evening, an hour before closing. The bell above the door rang as it always did, and Wilhelmina looked up from the account ledger she was reconciling at the counter. She noted a man she did not recognize, in road-worn clothes that were clean but not fresh, looking around the store with those quiet, evaluating eyes. She waited. Not all customers wanted to be greeted immediately, and a good storekeeper learned to read the difference. He came to the counter after a moment. "Miss Hawkins," he said. His voice had a slight southern edge to it, Georgia or maybe the Carolinas, worn almost smooth by years of somewhere else. "That is me," she said. "My name is Elias Conroy. I'm looking to buy a ranch operation in this area. I understand your father is Thomas Hawkins, and I was told he might know who has land available for sale." She looked at him directly in the way that unnerved most men. He looked back with what appeared to be perfectly easy composure. "My father is in the back. I can get him. But I know the land in this county as well as he does, probably better, since I keep the survey records for him. If you would like to tell me what you are looking for, I can give you a useful answer now rather than making you wait." He blinked once, which was the only sign of surprise he allowed himself. Most women in Caldwell did not open conversations by asserting their own competence over their father's. "That would suit me fine," he said. "How many acres?" she asked. "I would like at least 1,000 to start. Access to water is more important than total acreage. I run cattle, not crops, so I need reliable grass and water more than I need bottomland. What is your price range?" he told her. She did not flinch at the number, which was comfortable but not extravagant, and ran through her mental inventory of available properties with the same efficiency she applied to everything. "There are 3 properties that fit what you are describing," she said. "One is the old garrison spread on the North Fork, about 1,200 acres. Mr. Garrison died in the spring, and his widow wants to sell quickly and move back east to her family. The second is the Rafter T, which is larger, about 1,800 acres. But the owner, Pete Tolliver, is asking more than it is worth because he over-improved the structure and not the land. Third is a smaller parcel, 800 acres southeast of town, that belongs to the Delacroix estate and has been in probate for 2 years. It would require patience to acquire, but the price would be very favorable." He had been listening with an attention that she noticed, because most people listened to her for a moment and then looked for an older male voice to confirm what she had said. He kept his eyes on her and his attention did not wander. "Which one would you recommend?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. That was an unusual question. Men did not often ask her recommendation outright. "The garrison spread," she said. "The water rights on the North Fork are solid and already documented. The widow is motivated and will accept a fair offer without games. The land needs work, but it is good land underneath the neglect. Tolliver will waste your time and Delacroix will exhaust your patience." "The garrison spread it is then," he said. "Can you arrange an introduction to the widow?" "I can send a message tomorrow morning," she said. "She is in town. She boards at Clara Dunbar's place while she waits for a buyer." "So does," he said, and something like amusement moved across his face. "I am also at Clara's boarding house. I passed a woman in the hallway who did not seem the ranching type." "That must have been her." "That would be Agnes Garrison," Wilhelmina confirmed. 62 years old, from Baltimore originally. She grew up to hate the ranch and will not pretend otherwise." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the assessing look men gave women they found attractive, though there may have been some element of that. It was more like someone encountering something unexpected and taking time to properly identify it. "You are very direct," he said. "It was not a complaint." "I am told that regularly," she said with the neutrality of long practice. "It bothers some people." "Does it bother you that it bothers them?" The question surprised her. She considered it honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Less than it used to." He nodded slowly, as if this were a satisfactory and interesting answer. He bought a small quantity of supplies, tobacco, coffee, a tin of crackers, paid without haggling, and said he would be grateful for any introduction she could arrange with Agnes Garrison. He tipped his hat at the door and left. Wilhelmina watched the door close after him and sat for a moment before returning to her ledger. He was different. She could not immediately specify how, except that he had asked her opinion and meant it, and had not once looked past her toward the back room in search of her father. She mentioned him to her father that night at dinner, a plain recounting of the business of it. Thomas Hawkins said that Conroy was a name he had heard through the cattle circuit, that the man had a reputation for fair dealing and straight riding, that he had managed a large operation in Colorado before something. Thomas was not sure what had brought him south and east to Kansas. Wilhelmina filed this information away in the organized cabinet of her mind and thought no more about it that evening. In the morning, she sent a note to Agnes Garrison through Clara Dunbar's household, introducing Elias Conroy as a serious buyer for the North Fork property. Agnes Garrison's reply came within the hour. She would be delighted to discuss it over lunch. The lunch took place at the hotel dining room, the nicest eating establishment in Caldwell, which meant it had tablecloths and a menu written on a slate board. Agnes Garrison was a compact, sharp-minded woman who had spent 30 years in a place she never wanted to be, and had emerged from it with the particular clarity of someone who had burned away everything superfluous. She liked Elias Conroy immediately because he was direct and did not condescend to her, and she liked him more when he asked her straightforwardly what problems the property had that she had not yet told anyone about. Agnes blinked and then laughed. a short, genuine sound. "The north fence line is in dispute with my neighbor Harold Kessler," she said. "About 40 feet of it. He says the original survey was wrong. I say he is lying. You would need to resolve it before you can be sure of your eastern boundary." "I appreciate you telling me," he said. "A man asked me that question," Agnes told him, "because a woman named Wilhelmina Hawkins told me you were likely to ask it and that I ought to answer honestly." Elias Conroy looked briefly startled. Then a slow smile came to his face that changed it considerably, warming the green-gray of his eyes. "She told you that?" "She came to see me this morning before she sent the note," Agnes said. "She told me you were a serious buyer who did not want to have problems hidden from him, and that I would serve myself better by being plain about the fence dispute up front than by hoping you would not find it." He was quiet for a moment. "That was good advice," he said. "It usually is," Agnes said, "with Wilhelmina." He bought the garrison spread 2 weeks later for a fair price that covered the fence dispute and included Agnes's considerable furniture, which she did not want to transport to Baltimore. The deal was clean and quick, as Wilhelmina had predicted. In those 2 weeks he came into the general store 4 more times. Each time he bought what he actually needed, and each time he found a reason to ask Wilhelmina's opinion on something. The first time it was about the quality of different seed distributors. The second time it was about local water rights law and whether she knew anything about how the county handled fence disputes. The third time he asked her, with a straightforward curiosity that she found she was beginning to look for in the set of his face, what she thought of the current price of cattle on the Caldwell market versus what she had heard from drovers coming up the trail. And the fourth time, he did not buy anything at all. He came in on a slow Thursday morning when her father was away at a meeting of the County Merchants Association, and he stood at the counter and said, "Miss Hawkins, I wonder if you would walk with me. There is something I would like to show you about the North Fork property, and I would value your assessment of it." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. "What is it you want assessed?" she asked. "I found evidence of a second water source on the eastern portion," he said. "A spring that is not on the survey maps. Before I start construction of anything near it, I want to know what someone who knows this county's land thinks about it, whether it is reliable or seasonal." This was a genuine professional request, she could see that. And she was also aware that it was a reason to spend time in her company that went beyond a counter transaction, and that he knew she would see both things clearly, and had brought a real question precisely, because he understood that she would not come for a false one. She told her father's assistant, young Tommy Briggs, that she would be back by mid-afternoon, and she put on her coat and went. They rode out to the garrison spread on 2 horses from Silas Pemberton's livery, she on a steady-tempered gray mare she had ridden before, and he on the bay gelding he had apparently acquired in the 2 weeks since arriving in Caldwell. He was a good rider, balanced and easy, not showy. She noticed this the way she noticed most things, categorically, and without particular emotion attached. The North Fork property was indeed in a state of considered neglect, the kind of neglect that comes not from carelessness but from years of diminishing energy and one person trying to maintain what had been built for 2. The main house was solid, with good bones under the weathered paint. The cattle infrastructure was aged but repairable. The land itself, as she had told him, was genuinely good land. The grass was deep-rooted in the lowlands near the creek, and the soil had that particular dark richness that meant good grazing. He led her to the eastern portion, past a stand of cottonwood trees that rattled their last October leaves in the cold wind, and showed her the spring. It was a good-sized seep in a rock shelf, clear and cold and running steadily even now in the dry autumn. She crouched down and tested it with her hand, looked at the rock formation around it, traced the likely source direction with her eye. "This is a proper spring," she said. "Not a seep that will dry in summer. Look at the limestone formation here." She pointed. "This is the same formation that feeds the main fork. It is a deep source." This will run year-round in all but the worst drought years, and in a drought year your main fork will still carry you." He crouched beside her to look where she was pointing, and for a moment they were close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold air and the smell of horses and wood smoke that had settled into his coat. "I thought as much," he said, "but I wanted confirmation from someone who would tell me plainly if I was wrong." She stood. The wind pulled a strand of hair loose from her pins. She tucked it back with practiced efficiency. "You could have asked my father or any of a half-dozen men in Caldwell," she said. "I could have," he agreed, standing as well. "But you are the one who told Agnes Garrison to be honest about the fence dispute before the sale, which saved me from discovering a problem after the fact. That tells me more about your judgment than a recommendation would." She studied him with the direct amber gaze that had sent 3 men walking away. He received it with the same quiet composure he had shown at the counter. "Most men in this town think I am too blunt for my own good," she said. It was not a complaint or a bid for reassurance. It was a statement of fact offered in the same spirit she offered all facts. "I cannot speak for those men," he said. "I can tell you that in my experience a person who tells you the truth when a comfortable lie would serve them equally well is worth a great deal more than they are usually paid." He paused. "And I know that the men of this town have a particular opinion of you. Clara Dunbar told me, with considerable feeling, about your history with the local marriage market." A small color came to her face. Not quite a blush, because Wilhelmina did not blush easily, but something close to it, the faint warm color of someone who has been seen more clearly than they expected. "Clara talks more than she should," she said. "She is proud of you," he said simply. That was clear. She did not know what to do with this exactly. She turned and looked out across the property, the rolling grassland going gold and brown under the October sky, the blue line of the creek in the near distance, the cottonwoods standing like sentinels with their bare branches. It was good land. She had always thought the North Fork land was good land. "You are going to do well here," she said, "if you work it properly." "I intend to," he said. Then, after a moment, with a care that she would later realize had been very deliberate, "Miss Hawkins, would you be willing to have dinner with me this Friday, at the hotel dining room? I would like to continue our conversation in a context that is not your father's store counter." She turned to look at him. Direct look, direct question, no flinching from either side. "As a social engagement," she said, not asking, clarifying. "Yes," he said. "As a social engagement between 2 adults who seem to find each other's company worth having." She thought about it for a moment. That was not a dramatic pause but a genuine moment of consideration, because she was not a woman who answered important questions before she had looked at them. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He smiled, and it was the same warming smile she had first seen at Agnes Garrison's description of her advice, a smile that lived mostly in his eyes and arrived on his mouth afterward, unhurried. "Friday at 7, he said. "I will meet you at the hotel." She nodded once. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and mounted the gray mare with the ease of a woman who had been riding since she could reach the saddle, and turned back toward Caldwell, and he rode beside her in a companionable quiet that she found, somewhat to her surprise. She did not feel any particular desire to fill with unnecessary words. Friday dinner was the beginning of something that neither of them named directly for some time, but that everyone in Caldwell saw and began discussing with the particular enthusiasm a small town reserves for anything that might be romantic. The hotel dining room was warm and smelled of roasting beef and coffee. They sat at a corner table and talked for 3 hours, through 2 plates of food and 2 cups of coffee each, and the waitress, a young woman named Peggy Howard, later told Clara Dunbar that she had never seen Miss Hawkins talk so freely with anyone she had not known for years. He told her about his history in a way that was straightforward without being guarded. He had grown up in Georgia, the 3rd son of a family that had lost nearly everything in the war, and had spent the decade afterward rebuilding with the grim determination of people who could not afford grief as a luxury. He had gone west at 19 with little money and considerable stubbornness, worked cattle in Texas, worked his way up to trail bossman, managed a ranch in Colorado for 7 years for an owner he respected. The owner, an older man named Harlan Burke, had died the previous year and left the ranch to a son in Boston, who had immediately sold it to a large cattle company. Elias had stayed through the transition long enough to honor his obligation to the men who had worked under him, and then had spent 6 months looking for land of his own. "Why Kansas?" she asked. "The Kishom Trail," he said. "The trail won't run forever, but while it runs, the proximity to Caldwell and the railroad access matters. When the trail closes, the land itself will still support a solid operation if you are not dependent on trail traffic for your market. I want land that works with or without the current boom." She listened to this with evident interest. It was a reasonable and far-sighted analysis, and she said so. He asked about her own history with the same genuine curiosity he brought to everything, and she answered with a frankness that she had learned over the years to sometimes moderate with strangers, but that she found she did not want to moderate with him. She told him about growing up in the store, learning accounts before she learned needlework, about studying the county land surveys because they interested her, about the 3 men and the 3 failed weddings. She told him this without drama or self-pity, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting on weather patterns. He listened without the uncomfortable shifting and sympathetic wincing that the subject usually produced in people. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You told the first man he was not particularly handsome. Was that true?" "Verifiably so," she said. "He was not an ugly man, but he was not handsome. He had bulging eyes and a weak chin. He knew it. He simply wanted someone to tell him something different, and you would not." "I had no reason to," she said. "He had good qualities. I told him the good qualities. That was not enough for him." He was quiet again, looking at her with that evaluating look that had begun to feel to her not like assessment, but like attention, genuine full attention of the kind that was rarer than it should be. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I suspect you prefer plain." "I do," she confirmed. "I have been told by enough people in enough places that a straightforward manner is a fault," he said. "I have watched people twist themselves into complicated shapes to tell comfortable lies, and I have watched those lies compound over time until no one could remember what the truth was anymore. In my experience, a person who tells you the truth even when it costs them something is not difficult. They are essential." He looked at her steadily. "I am glad the men of this town were too proud to marry you. I think they did me a considerable favor." The silence after this was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something and both recognizing it. "That is a very direct thing to say," she said finally. "I believe I am in good company," he said, and the smile came, the warm, unhurried one. She looked down at her coffee cup for just a moment, which was as close to flustered as she was capable of being. Then she looked back up. "Mr. Conroy," she said, "I believe you may be the first man I have ever met who said something that surprised me." "I hope to keep surprising you," he said. They walked back toward Clara's boarding house afterward because it was on her way home, and the October night was cold and clear with a sky full of stars, and the sound of the saloon 2 streets over carrying tinny piano music on the wind. She wore a wool coat and she was not cold, but she was aware of him beside her in a way that was physical and new and not unpleasant at all. At the corner where their paths diverged, he stopped. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I would like to see you again, socially, with whatever frequency you find appropriate." She did not pretend to consider this longer than she needed to. "Next Sunday," she said. "My father has a habit of cooking a large midday meal on Sundays. He will be pleased to have someone to talk cattle markets with. I will not pretend it is not an introduction, because it clearly will be." "I appreciate you not pretending," he said. "Sunday midday. I will bring something for the table." He brought a very good whiskey, which Thomas Hawkins appreciated enormously. The Sunday dinner lasted 4 hours. Thomas Hawkins and Elias Conroy talked cattle, land, railroad economics, and politics with the mutual ease of two practical men who respected each other's intelligence. Wilhelmina participated fully, correcting her father on one point about the railroad rate structure with a citation from a recent Kansas City paper she had read, and watching to see how Elias received this. He received it with interest, asked her to elaborate, and told her she was right when she was. Thomas Hawkins, who had been watching all of this from the comfortable position of a man who had nothing to prove, caught Elias' eye across the table at one point and held it for a moment with an expression that said clearly, "This is who she is. If you are still here next Sunday, I will know you understand that." Elias was there next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. October moved into November, and the cold came down from the north in earnest, the kind of cold that turned the mud of Caldwell's Main Street to iron and made the horses steam. Elias was working the North Fork property with the systematic energy of a man who had planned carefully and was now executing the plan. He had hired 3 good hands, a wiry Mexican cowhand named Miguel Santos who had ridden with him in Colorado, a quiet Kansan named Burl Hicks who knew the local land well, and a young man of 19 named Danny Marsh who was new to ranch work but learned fast and worked without complaint. He was repairing fences, reinforcing the main house against the winter, improving the cattle infrastructure. He was also, with the help of Miguel's considerable cooking talent, eating reasonably well for a man living on a newly acquired ranch. He came to the store regularly, which was legitimate commerce as well as time with Wilhelmina, and she came out to the ranch twice to look at a drainage question he had about the western pasture, and once to tell him that she had found, in the county records, a corrected survey that resolved his fence dispute with Harold Kessler definitively in his favor. This last piece of news she delivered on a cold November afternoon, standing on his porch with the wind in her face and the old survey document rolled under her arm, and he looked at her standing there in the gray afternoon light with the wind making loose strands of her dark auburn hair fly around her face, and something shifted in him that he recognized as the point of no return. "How did you find this?" he asked. "I went to the county clerk's office," she said. "I had a feeling the original survey was off. I looked for the resurvey and found it filed under the wrong year, a clerical error that had kept it from being found. It has been there since 1871. Wilhelmina," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss, and they both noticed it. He did not apologize. She did not ask him to. "I do not know what to say." "You do not need to say anything," she said. "The document does the talking." But he stepped forward and took the document from under her arm and held it with one hand and took her hand with his other, and he looked at her in the way that had been building since the first day at the counter, direct, full, certain. "I need to say something," he said. "I am not a man who waits when he knows his own mind." "I know," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I am aware that we have known each other a little less than 2 months. I am also aware that I am the kind of man who has lived enough life to know the difference between infatuation and something that runs deep and true. This runs deep and true. I intend to ask you to marry me. I am telling you now so that it is not a surprise and so you have time to consider it honestly, because I know you well enough to know that you would rather think than react." The wind was cold and the sky was gray, and her hand was warm in his. She looked at him with the full amber directness of those eyes, and what he saw in them was not surprise. He had been right that it was not a surprise, but something quieter and more vulnerable than her usual composure, a softness that she did not show often, and that arrived now because she was not the kind of woman who could successfully hide what was true. "I am in love with you too," she said, and her voice was steady because she was a steady woman, but he heard the depth underneath the steadiness. "I have been for at least 3 weeks, and I have been arguing with myself about it because the timing seemed impractical. "The timing is exactly what it is," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a deliberate and tender gesture. "Will you give me until spring?" he said. "I want to have the house properly ready. I want to have the fence dispute resolved with the document you have just given me. I want to come to your father with everything in proper order." "You do not need to come to my father in any particular order," she said. "I am 26 years old and I will make my own decision." "I know that," he said. "I want to do it properly because I respect him, not because I need his permission." She looked at him for another moment and then she smiled, which was a rare and beautiful thing that arrived on her face like light breaking through, genuine, unguarded, and wholly without artifice. "All right," she said. "Spring." He walked her back to where her horse was tied at the fence, and she mounted the gray mare and rode back toward Caldwell, and he stood at his porch in the cold and watched her go with the exact feeling of a man who has come home after a very long road. November deepened into December, and Caldwell prepared for the cold season with the practical intensity of a frontier town that knew winter was not a metaphor. The cattle trade slowed as the trail shut down for the season, but the town did not stop. There were ranchers and farmers and their families. There was the school and the church. There was the merchant life that continued regardless of the season. Thomas Hawkins's store was busy with people laying in winter stores. Wilhelmina and Elias had moved into a kind of courtship that was not secret. Caldwell was too small for secrets, but that they conducted with a mutual directness that was entirely their own. He came to Sunday dinners. She came to the ranch occasionally on legitimate business, and sometimes not on legitimate business at all, simply to see him. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, along the North Fork with the leafless cottonwoods dark against the winter sky, talking about everything. His plans for the ranch, her thoughts about the store's future, books they had read, the politics of the territory, the management of the cattle market, the nature of honesty and the social costs of it. She told him once, on a gray December afternoon with snow threatening on the horizon, about the third time she had been left at the altar. About the pause before Boyd Carver's question. She told it carefully, the way she had examined it many times since, looking for what she should have done differently. "The truthful answer was that I cared for him," she said. "That was not nothing, but I could not say I loved him entirely when I was not certain I did, and I will not say something I am not certain of. I have thought about whether that is stubbornness." "Is it?" he asked. "No," she said. "I do not think so. I think it is simply the inability to substitute a comfortable word for a true one. I am not built for comfortable substitutions." "Neither am I," he said. "I think we are well matched in that regard." "I think we are well matched in several regards," she said, and looked at him with the amber gaze that held nothing back. He reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand briefly, gloved hand to gloved hand, a small, warm gesture in the cold air. They rode on in the companionable quiet that had become one of her favorite things about him. The fact that silence between them was never uncomfortable, was never filled with the anxious social noise she had always found exhausting. Christmas in Caldwell in 1878 was a modest affair by any larger city measure, but genuine in the way of communities that were still close enough to the difficulty of survival to celebrate with real gratitude rather than mere habit. The church put on a program, and the hotel dining room had a special supper, and there were gatherings in houses across town with music and food, and the particular warmth of people who have chosen to make their home in a hard place and are glad of the choosing. Elias came to the Hawkins house for Christmas dinner, which Thomas Hawkins had clearly been expecting and prepared for with the purchase of a considerably better cut of beef than usual. Clara Dunbar came with her mother, and old Mrs. Perkins, whom Wilhelmina always invited for holidays, and it was a full table of people who knew each other well and were glad of each other's company. After dinner, when Thomas had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire and Clara's mother had gone home early on account of a cold, and Clara herself was helping Wilhelmina with the dishes in the kitchen, Clara said, with the directness she had borrowed over the years from her friend. "He looks at you like you are the only sensible thing in a room full of foolishness." Wilhelmina dried a plate with careful attention. "He is a very sensible man himself," she said. "That is not what I said," Clara observed. "I know what you said," Wilhelmina told her, and allowed herself a small private smile. Elias found her later, in the sitting room looking out the frost-edged window at the dark December street. He stood beside her and they were quiet together for a moment, the fire warm behind them and the cold world on the other side of the glass, and he said quietly, "I am glad I came to Caldwell." "So am I," she said. "I was not, in general, finding it a particularly agreeable place before you arrived." "I suspect you found it perfectly agreeable," he said. "I think what changed is that you found a specific person in it agreeable." She turned to look at him. He was close, in the warm firelit room, close enough that she could see the green and gray of his eyes clearly in the light. "You are occasionally insufferably right," she said. "I will try to bear that with humility," he said, and the smile came, warm and unhurried. He had brought her a gift, a copy of a book of Western Survey maps and land records covering Kansas and the surrounding territories. A serious practical gift that was also, she understood immediately, a statement about what he thought of her mind and her interests. She had given him a new set of account books for the ranch, with her handwriting in the front page, setting up a system she had designed for him. They had laughed about the mutual practicality of their gifts, and then she had said, very quietly, that she thought it was the best Christmas present she had received in years, and he had said the same, and they had both meant it entirely. January was brutal. The cold that settled on Kansas that winter was the kind that tested both buildings and people, the kind that froze the creek and buried the pastures in 2 feet of snow and killed cattle that were not properly sheltered. Elias worked the North Fork through it with the grim, competent energy she had begun to recognize as his signature in difficulty, methodical, unruffled, decisive. He lost 6 cattle in the worst week of it, and saved 30 more by working nights alongside his hands, in the kind of weather that did not care about rank. Miguel Santos later told Burl Hicks, who told Silas Pemberton, who told half the town, that the new man at the North Fork had worked like a common hand in the blizzard, no different from the rest of them, and that he had also come out at 3 in the morning when young Danny Marsh had gone to check the south pasture fence and not come back, and had found Danny in a drift a half-mile from the barn, cold but alive, and carried him back himself. This story reached Wilhelmina through the town's telegraph of gossip, and it landed in her chest with a warmth that was not surprise but was still powerfully felt. She went out to the ranch the day after the worst of it broke, ostensibly with supplies she had loaded in a wagon: coffee, flour, medicine, extra blankets, and actually because she needed to see him with her own eyes. She found him in the barn working on a fence post with a methodical weariness that told her he had not slept properly in 3 days. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face relaxed in a way that was involuntary and visible, the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just seen someone arrive who can be trusted to help carry it. "You did not need to come," he said. "I know I did not need to," she said. "I wanted to." She set down the basket she was carrying. "Also, you need proper food and someone to look at Danny Marsh's hands. Frostbite has to be watched." Danny Marsh, who was sitting on a hay bale with his hands wrapped, looked up at this with the transparent relief of a 19-year-old who had been trying to be stoic about it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She checked Danny's hands with the confident efficiency of a woman who had learned field medicine from her mother before she died and from Dr. Ames in town over the years. The frostbite was superficial and properly treated, and she told Danny so, and then turned to the stove in the corner of the barn office where someone had made coffee and poured 2 cups and handed one to Elias without asking. He took it and drank it and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You rode out in the aftermath of a blizzard with supplies," he said. "I did," she said. "Wilhelmina," he said. It had been her name without the miss for 2 months now, and she had come to love the sound of it in his voice. "When spring comes." "Yes," she said, not a question. "I am going to ask your father," he said, "and then I am going to ask you." "I know," she said. "I want to be sure you know that I am asking because I intend this to be permanent," he said. "Not because it is the expected next step or because it is what people in our situation do. Because I want to spend the rest of my life talking to you honestly." She looked at him in the cold barn with the wind still rattling the boards and the coffee warm in her hands, and the man she loved standing 3 feet away looking at her, as though everything important was contained in this exact moment. And she felt it arrive fully. The thing she had not been able to claim with Gerald Prout or Amos Whitfield or Boyd Carver. The thing she had not been sure she was built to feel. The lightning-strike feeling she had read about in novels and been honest enough not to pretend to. It was here. It was exactly what the novels had described, translated into the real language of a real morning after a real blizzard, which was better than any novel because it was true. "I know that," she said. "And I want you to know that when you ask me, the answer is yes. I am telling you now so that you can come to the asking without any uncertainty, because I know you prefer to know where the ground is solid before you step on it." He set down his coffee cup on the edge of the stove and crossed the 3 feet between them and put his hands on either side of her face very gently and kissed her for the first time, carefully and without rush. And she set down her own cup and kissed him back. And the barn, with its cold and its wind and its smell of horses and hay and wood smoke, was the most romantic place she had ever been in her life. Danny Marsh, to his considerable credit, found something to look at in the far corner of the barn and whistled quietly to himself. The winter finished out with a gradual, reluctant warming, the way Kansas winters sometimes gave ground inch by inch, grudgingly, the snow thinning on the south-facing slopes first, and then the north pastures showing patches of brown grass, and then the creek breaking up and running clear and fast with snowmelt, and then the particular morning in mid-March when the air changed, and everyone in the county who had been holding their breath breathed out. Elias had kept his word. In the first week of March, before the ground was fully thawed, he came to the Hawkins house on a Sunday evening and asked Thomas Hawkins for a private word after dinner. Thomas, who had been watching this development with a combination of parental hope and genuine personal liking for the man, took him to the sitting room and listened while Elias said directly and simply that he wanted to marry Wilhelmina if she would have him, that he understood she was a woman of full, independent character, and did not need anyone's permission for anything, but that he respected Thomas and wanted his blessing as the father of the woman he intended to spend his life with. Thomas Hawkins, who had spent 3 years watching his youngest daughter be left at altars by men who could not manage the truth, looked at Elias Conroy for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "The honest truth is that I have been waiting for someone like you to come to this town for several years. I was starting to worry he did not exist." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing and my welcome." Elias shook his hand and they sat back down and Thomas poured whiskey, the good kind, and they talked for half an hour while Wilhelmina, who had been entirely aware of what was happening in the sitting room and had been sitting in the kitchen drinking tea with a composure that Clara Dunbar, had she been present, would have seen right through, waited. Then Elias came to the kitchen doorway and she looked up. "Walk with me," he said. The March evening was cold but clear, with a smell of mud and coming spring that was entirely distinct from any other time of year, and that she had always loved. They walked down the dark street with the stars very bright above, and the sounds of the town settling into night around them. They had walked this same street a dozen times in the past months. It was familiar and ordinary and entirely charged with the feeling of the specific moment in which they were living. He stopped at the corner where they had stood on their first dinner night, where their paths diverged. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple one, a band of gold with a single small garnet set in it, a dark red stone that caught the light of the street lantern. He had had it made by the jeweler in Wichita whom he had visited specifically for this purpose the previous month. He held it up between them. "Wilhelmina Hawkins," he said, "I am in love with you. You are the most honest person I have ever known, and I consider that the highest quality a human being can possess. I would like to spend the rest of my life being told the truth by you, and telling it back, and building something with you that is as solid as the North Fork land because it has an honest foundation. Will you marry me?" She had known this was coming. She had told him weeks ago that the answer was yes. None of that made the moment less than what it was, standing on the dark street in the first breath of spring with this man who had arrived in her town on a Tuesday afternoon and changed everything about it by simply being someone who valued the same things she did. "Yes," she said. "Elias, yes." He put the ring on her finger and it fit, because he had asked Clara Dunbar very quietly 2 weeks ago to find out the size of Wilhelmina's ring finger without letting on why. Clara had done so with the enthusiastic covert skill of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and was delighted to be part of it. He folded her hand in both of his, and they stood in the street in the cold spring night, and she put her other hand over his and they looked at each other, and there was nothing unsaid between them, which was exactly the way both of them preferred it. Clara Dunbar, who had been watching from her boarding-house window because she had seen them walk by and had an instinct for the significant moment, later said that it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years, and that she had definitely not cried, which was absolutely false. The wedding was set for the last Saturday in May, giving Elias time to complete the most urgent work on the North Fork house, and giving Wilhelmina time to do what she had not done for the previous 3 engagements, which was approach the preparations with full-hearted certainty. She chose a dress with Clara's help, not white, because she was practical and it was Kansas and white was not practical, but a cream-colored silk cotton blend that she had ordered from a dry goods supplier in Kansas City, and that arrived 3 weeks before the wedding. It was a good dress. It suited her exactly, fitting close through the bodice and fuller in the skirt, and it was neither extravagant nor insufficient. The church was scrubbed and filled with early summer flowers by the ladies of the sewing circle, several of whom had reconsidered their opinions of Wilhelmina in recent months, and several of whom had simply always liked her, and were glad of the occasion to show it. Reverend Duncan prepared a ceremony that he had discussed with both Wilhelmina and Elias separately and together, and that contained, at Wilhelmina's specific request, vows that said what they meant rather than what they always said. May in Kansas in 1879 was generous, the land green and gold, the air warm with a cool edge, the sky that particular enormous blue that made the world feel like it had been cleaned overnight. The morning of the wedding, Wilhelmina stood in her father's bedroom looking at herself in his mirror, the only mirror in the house large enough to show her from the waist up, wearing the cream dress with her dark auburn hair put up more elaborately than usual, a few small flowers tucked in by Clara's capable hands. She looked at herself for a long moment. She thought about Gerald Prout, who had wanted her to tell him he was handsome. She thought about Amos Whitfield, who had not wanted to hear about the flood basin. She thought about Boyd Carver on the church steps, reading her pause correctly. She thought about the 3 years since Boyd Carver had walked down those steps, the years of the town's whispers and the sewing circle's verdicts, and her own private certainty that she would not lie herself into a marriage. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon in October, a stage from Wichita, a man in a clay-colored duster coat with green-gray eyes who had asked her opinion and meant it. She thought about what he had said on his porch in November, with the cold wind in both their faces and the survey document under her arm. A person who tells you the truth even when it costs them something is not difficult. They are essential. She picked up her small bouquet of flowers and went to marry him. Thomas Hawkins walked her down the aisle with his arms stiff and his eyes slightly too bright, which was as close as Thomas Hawkins came to crying in public. Clara Dunbar stood beside Wilhelmina. Miguel Santos stood beside Elias, because Elias had known him longest and trusted him completely, and Miguel had accepted the role with the solemn formality of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. The church was full. Caldwell had turned out in its entirety, because it was that kind of town, and this was that kind of occasion, one that people felt, without necessarily articulating it, was in some way a vindication of something worth vindicating. Even Martha Greer from the millinery was there, and she cried openly, which was perhaps the most surprising thing about the entire event. Wilhelmina and Elias faced each other at the altar, and the Reverend spoke his words and they spoke theirs. And when Elias said, with the quiet certainty that was the voice she had come to know as his truest register, "I promise to honor the truth in you and to speak truth to you, every day of our lives together, in good fortune and in hardship, without exception," she felt the vows settle into her the way nothing had ever settled before, solid and real and permanent. She said her own vows back clearly, without trembling, in the full voice of a woman who was saying exactly what she meant. Reverend Duncan pronounced them married. Elias kissed her, a proper kiss in front of the whole congregation, and the church erupted in the kind of noise that was the combined release of everyone who had been holding their breath through 3 previous failures and was now finally, gratefully, gladly letting it out. The wedding supper was held in the church hall and spilled out onto the summer lawn when it grew too warm inside, and there was music from 3 fiddle players and dancing on the wooden boards they had laid on the grass. And the food was a collective production of half the women in town who had each brought a dish, which meant it was abundant and excellent and entirely too much for even a full town to eat. Thomas Hawkins danced 3 times, which was more than he had danced in 10 years. Clara Dunbar danced with Miguel Santos twice and spent the second dance looking slightly flustered, which Wilhelmina noted with private amusement. Danny Marsh danced with every young woman who would have him, which was most of them. And Wilhelmina danced with her husband, the word still new enough to be remarkable, dancing on the boards in the summer evening with the stars coming out above, and the fiddles playing something quick and bright that eventually slowed into something that let them stop moving and simply stand close together with her head against his shoulder and his arms around her and the whole warm evening around them. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly against her hair. "Completely," she said. It was the truth. They rode out to the North Fork Ranch that night, because it was home now, and the house was ready and had been cleaned and prepared by Danny and Burl and Miguel, who had spent 2 days making it suitable, and had left a meal on the table and fresh flowers in a jar on the windowsill, which was Miguel's touch, and which made Wilhelmina unexpectedly and briefly emotional in the doorway. The ranch house was not grand. It had 4 rooms, a wood-burning stove that heated it adequately, a kitchen that needed work, a good solid bedroom with a window that looked east toward the creek. She had already been planning what she would do with it, not transformations, but improvements, the kind that came from someone who understood both the practical and the personal requirements of a place. She had brought her books and her survey records and her account system, and these were already on the shelves of the room Elias had set aside as a study for them both. He showed her the east window in the bedroom that first night, pointing out how in the morning the light came in full and gold across the bedroom floor, and she stood beside him at the window in the dark, looking at the silver line of the creek in the moonlight. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and thought that this was what it was to be exactly where you were supposed to be. The first year of their marriage was a working year, as all first years on a ranch were, with the particular intensity of 2 people who had both been managing things alone and were now learning to manage together, which was mostly harmonious and occasionally required negotiation. She took over the accounts and supply management with his full and grateful support, because he was a better horseman and a better manager of men, and she was a better accountant and a better negotiator with suppliers, and they were both honest enough to know their respective strengths without ego getting in the way. The cattle business was good in 1879. The Kishom Trail was still running, and the proximity to Caldwell mattered. Elias made a deal with a buyer from Wichita that Wilhelmina had helped him structure over several evenings at the kitchen table, with maps and price charts spread between their coffee cups, and the price they got for their first trail sale was better than what most ranchers in the county received. The word got around, as words do, and 2 other ranchers came to Elias quietly to ask how he had achieved it, and he told them honestly, giving credit to Wilhelmina's analysis, which they received with varying degrees of surprise and respect. Harold Kessler, whose fence dispute had been resolved against him by the corrected survey document, was not friendly for the first year. He was a proud man, and a losing argument was not something he forgave quickly. But in the second summer, his milk cow got out through a broken fence and ended up in Elias' north pasture, and Elias had Danny Marsh return it the next morning with the fence rail that had broken, already repaired, without being asked. Kessler came to the property line himself to receive the cow and stood looking at the repaired fence for a long moment, and then looked at Elias and said, grudgingly, that he appreciated it. It was not a friendship, but it was the beginning of the peaceable neighborliness that made a working community function. Clara Dunbar and Miguel Santos, which Wilhelmina had seen coming since the wedding dance and had said nothing about because it was not her story to tell, were married in the autumn of 1879, a smaller and quieter ceremony than the May wedding but equally genuine. Wilhelmina stood beside Clara as she had stood beside Elias, and thought that honest women found each other and made each other's lives better. By the spring of 1880, Wilhelmina knew she was pregnant. She told Elias on a morning in March when they were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with their coffee, which was where they had told each other most things, because it was a good place for truth, 2 people fully awake and facing each other over something warm. "I believe I am going to have a baby," she said. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before but recognized immediately, a stunned and soaring happiness that he was working hard not to make theatrical, but that was simply too large to contain entirely. "You believe," he said. "I am certain," she said. "I said believe because it is the honest word for knowing something you have not yet had confirmed by a physician." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with that enormous warm expression. Then he said, "I love you more than I have the words for." "You have very good words," she said. "Not good enough," he said, and pressed a kiss to her hands and then stood and pulled her up and held her carefully in the kitchen in the March morning light. The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months, with a persistent nausea that she found inconvenient and managed with the same pragmatic will she brought to every inconvenient thing. She continued working the accounts, continued riding out to check the pastures until Elias asked her, not with authority but with plain worry in his voice, to take the wagon rather than the horse in the later months, which she agreed to because his worry was legitimate, and she had no desire to dismiss legitimate worry. Dr. Ames came out to the ranch in early October 1880 when the time was close, and on a cool October morning, 2 years almost to the month after Elias Conroy had stepped off a stage from Wichita in a clay-colored duster coat, their son was born. He was a solid, loud, dark-haired boy who arrived with considerable announcement and looked immediately, according to Clara Dunbar, who was present, like a combination of both his parents, her coloring and something of his expression, which Clara said meant he would be simultaneously very attractive and very difficult to argue with. They named him Thomas Elias Conroy, for her father and for his, and Thomas Hawkins, who had ridden out to the ranch the morning he heard the news with a speed remarkable for a man of his age, held his grandson and wept without any attempt at concealment, and said that he had known all along, from the moment he saw Elias Conroy looking at his daughter across the store counter, that everything was going to be all right. Thomas, the baby, not the grandfather, though the shared name caused some pleasant confusion, was a vigorous and opinionated infant who grew into a vigorous and opinionated child, walking earlier than expected and talking in complete sentences almost immediately after that, which everyone agreed was inevitable. He had his mother's directness and his father's composure, and would in later years combine these qualities into a particularly formidable personality that served him extremely well. The ranch grew through the early 1880s with the steady growth of a well-managed operation. Elias hired 2 more hands as the cattle numbers grew, and built a second barn, and extended the fencing east toward the second spring. Wilhelmina's accounts operation had by this point extended to include the books for 2 other small ranches whose owners had, with mixed feelings and considerable relief, admitted that they needed better financial management than they were providing themselves. She was paid for this work because she insisted on it, and the income was banked against the future. In 1882, they had a daughter. They named her Elias Conroy, for no one in particular, simply because they liked the name and it fit the look of her, which was wide-eyed and serious from the first week of her life. Eliza had her father's green-gray eyes and would in time also have his habit of evaluating a situation with quiet thoroughness before committing to an action. The town of Caldwell in the early 1880s was changing, as all cattle towns changed. The trail traffic was beginning to decline as the railroads expanded, and the long drives became less necessary. New barbed wire was coming in that was changing the nature of fencing and land management. The open range era was ending slowly but visibly, and the ranchers who would survive were the ones who managed the transition, who owned their land outright, documented their water rights, diversified their cattle operations, and adapted to the new economics. Elias had seen this coming. He had talked about it with Wilhelmina through 100 kitchen table conversations, working through the projections and the options with the survey maps and the price charts and her account books spread between them. They had bought additional acreage when it became available and affordable, documented every water right with the county clerk, and begun diversifying the cattle stock for quality rather than solely quantity. When the final trail drives went through Caldwell in 1884, they were positioned better than most. There were hard years, too, because this was Kansas and there were always hard years. A drought year in 1883 that cost them 30% of their cattle and required the kind of grinding management that tested both the ranch and the people running it. A winter in 1885 that came down from the north with the same brutal force as the winter 2 weeks after their first meeting, and that they weathered now with more resources and more experience in each other, which made it different. There was a year when the market went soft, and the prices they got for their cattle were painful, and Wilhelmina sat with her account books and found the way through it that was possible, not easy but possible, and told him exactly what it was. He had once said that a person who told you the truth, even when it cost them, something was essential. She had proved it over and over in the years of their marriage, in the hard conversations and the unwelcome assessments, and the times when what she saw clearly was not what he had hoped to hear. And he had proved himself her equal in it, telling her when he thought she was wrong and being occasionally right about it, and telling her when he was worried, and when something had not gone as planned, without cover and without the comfortable evasions that eroded trust in other people's marriages. They argued sometimes. They were both direct people with clear opinions about most things, and when their opinions differed, the argument was real and thorough and not short. But the arguments had no venom in them, because neither of them was afraid of the other's honesty, and when they were done, they were fully done, with nothing left to fester. Thomas Hawkins, who had observed a great many marriages from the vantage of a general storekeeper who saw everyone and heard everything, said once to Clara Dunbar that his daughter's marriage was the healthiest he had witnessed in 20 years in this town, and he attributed it to the fact that neither of them had ever told the other a comfortable lie and lived with each other better for it. Thomas Hawkins himself died in the spring of 1886, quietly in his sleep, at 64 years old, which was a reasonable age for a man who had worked hard and survived a great deal. He had spent the last years of his life in the comfortable certainty that his most difficult daughter had found the life she deserved, which he said explicitly to Wilhelmina in one of the last conversations they had, sitting on the porch of the ranch house while young Thomas, 5 years old, chased a barn cat around the yard, and Eliza sat in her mother's lap examining a flower with the careful attention of a child who had inherited both parents' observational habits. She held her father's hand on the porch and he said, "You were right, Mina. The problem was never you." She held his hand tighter. "I know, Papa," she said. "I knew it then too, but it was good to wait for someone who knew it as well." The store passed to a young man named Carl Benson, whom Thomas had been training for 2 years, having correctly assessed that his daughter's life was now fully placed elsewhere and that the store needed a dedicated manager. Wilhelmina helped Carl set up his accounts and organize his supplier relationships, and spent 2 months training him in the methodical system she had used for years. He was a quick learner, and she told him so plainly, which he received with visible relief, because he had heard about her directness and had been waiting for a critical assessment. The children grew. Thomas Elias Conroy at 6 was already following his father around the ranch with the serious application of a boy who has decided that ranching is his life's work and is treating this decision with appropriate gravity. He had his mother's way with numbers and was already making his father explain the cattle count to him in detail, asking follow-up questions that Elias answered fully and honestly, because the habit of honest engagement was simply the register of their family. He had also, at 4 years old, told a neighbor's wife with complete sincerity that her pie was not as good as his mother's, which had caused a social incident that Wilhelmina had managed with the practiced combination of amusement and apology that she had developed as a parent. She had explained to him afterward, without contradicting him or asking him to lie, that there was a difference between truth offered when asked and truth offered when not asked, and that the world ran somewhat more smoothly when one learned to distinguish between the two. He had considered this at length and said, "But her pie really isn't as good." She had said, "That is entirely accurate." We will continue to discuss this. Eliza was quieter than her brother but watched everything with those green-gray eyes and had the habit of waiting until exactly the right moment to speak, and when she spoke, it was usually worth hearing. At 3, she had told her father very calmly that the axle on the supply wagon was making a different sound than usual, and that he should look at it, and he had looked at it and found a stress crack that would have broken on the next heavy load. He had looked at his daughter for a long moment, and then lifted her up and told her she had good ears and better judgment, and she had accepted this with the serenity of someone who had simply reported a fact. In the autumn of 1887, Wilhelmina was 35 years old and had been married for 8 years. She stood at the east window of the bedroom on a September morning, the light coming in gold across the floor the way it always did, looking out at the North Fork land that she knew by now with the intimacy of a person who has walked every acre of it in every season. The cottonwoods by the creek were beginning to turn, the first yellow showing at the edges of the leaves. The grass was still green from a good summer's rain. She could see the cattle in the south pasture, small and orderly in the distance, and the figure of her husband riding the fence line on his bay horse. A third bay horse by now, each one a gelding named with a consistency that amused her, simply bay. Elias rode with the same ease he had always ridden, balanced and unhurried, and he turned at the far fence corner and rode back along the line toward the barn, and at the distance she could see him clearly enough to know the particular set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his attention as he looked at the land, and she thought, as she sometimes thought when she caught him at an unguarded angle, that she had been given an extraordinary thing in this man, not because he was without flaws, because he was not. She could list them as readily as she could list his virtues, but because what he was true, and she was able to trust that what she saw was what was there. She went to the kitchen and put coffee on and listened to the house wake up around her. The sound of Thomas coming down the stairs with more energy than was strictly necessary in the morning, the quieter sound of Eliza behind him, the barn door in the distance that meant Burl Hicks was starting the morning chores. She heard the bay horse in the yard and then the door, and Elias came in with cold air and the smell of the morning on his coat, and he looked at her at the stove and she looked at him, and it was the 10,000th version of this morning moment, and she thought that it would never stop being good. "The south fence needs new posts in 2 places," he said, taking off his coat. "I will put it in the maintenance log," she said. "And the Hendersons want to sell the 40 acres on our east border," he said. "Orville told me when I was in town yesterday. They are moving to Colorado." She poured his coffee and her own, and they sat down at the kitchen table, and she said, "What are they asking?" He told her, and she got up and got the account book from the study shelf, still in her dressing gown, and sat back down and ran the numbers. "We can manage it if we defer the new barn roof until spring," she said. "The current roof will hold another winter if we reseal it in October." "Will it?" he said. "I have looked at it," she said. "It will hold." "Then we buy the Henderson 40, he said. "Yes," she said. "And next year we reseal the new roof properly." He smiled at her across the table, the warm, unhurried smile that was still, after 8 years and 10,000 mornings, the specific thing she most loved on his face. "What would I do without you?" he said. "You would make do," she said honestly, "but your accounts would be a disaster, and you would have bought the Tolliver Ranch at an inflated price in 1878 and spent 3 years recovering from the error." He laughed, a full, genuine sound that filled the kitchen. "That is probably accurate," he said. Thomas came clattering into the kitchen with a question about whether he could ride with Miguel today to check the east pasture, and Eliza came behind him with her quiet, deliberate step, and climbed into a chair, and began examining the account book that her mother had left on the table with the focused interest of a child who had decided that numbers were interesting, which her parents regarded as both predictable and excellent. The life of the ranch unrolled around them with all its texture and all its weight, the good and the difficult, the seasons of abundance and the seasons of hardship, the 10,000 small negotiations and decisions that constituted the actual substance of a life built together. There was no moment that was not real. There was no comfort that was not earned. There was no single easy day, because Kansas ranching in the 1880s did not produce easy days, and they would not have asked for them if it could, because ease was not what they had built together. What they had built was something sounder than ease. They had built a life on the premise that they would tell each other the truth, and this premise, which had cost Wilhelmina 3 men and years of a small town's judgment before it was honored, had turned out to be the only premise worth building on. Every fence on the North Fork property was honest. Every account was accurate. Every conversation between them was real. On a late September evening in 1887, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the last warm light of the season, the children inside doing what children do in the evening hour, the ranch quiet around them, the cottonwoods gold along the creek, and the sky going the deep blue of almost dark. He had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, the same posture they had come to in 100 evenings on this porch over the years, and she was thinking, with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she wanted to remember, about the full shape of what their life was. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said, in the easy voice of a man who had been hearing truth from this woman for 9 years and had never once wished she would stop. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said. "I know that is not a complicated thing to say, but I want to say it plainly because it is true and because you should know." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was sometimes quiet, not from absence but from presence, from holding the weight of a thing properly before he responded. Then he said, "I want you to know something in return." "Tell me," she said, using his own words back to him. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. "Not in spite of your honesty, because of it, because of exactly what you are. And I am grateful every day that the men of this town were not equal to you, because it meant you were here when I arrived." She felt the familiar warmth of this, not the stunned newness of the early days, but the deep, steady warmth of something that had had years to settle into the bones and stay. "They were not equal to it," she agreed, "but I believe I waited for the one who was." He pressed a kiss to her temple. She closed her eyes. The last light went from gold to rose over the Kansas grassland, and the creek caught it, and the cottonwood leaves shook in the evening wind, and the North Fork property that had been the garrison spread. And then Elias Conroy's land, and was now unmistakably and completely theirs, held them in the good quiet of a world that had, through honest work and honest love and the refusal to mistake a comfortable lie for a livable truth, become exactly what it needed to be. They sat together until the light was gone and the first stars were clear, and the children came to the door to call them in for supper, Thomas's voice carrying the specific urgency of a 7-year-old who is very hungry, Eliza's quieter note underneath it, and they went in together to the lit warmth of their kitchen, where the stove was hot and the table was set and their family was assembled around it. And Wilhelmina Hawkins Conroy, who had been told more times than she could count that she was too honest to be loved, sat down at the head of her table and looked at her husband across it and knew, with the settled certainty of someone who has never been willing to know anything else, that she had been right all along. The years continued to be good. In 1889, when Kansas was full of talk about the opening of the Oklahoma Territory lands to settlement, and every rancher was calculating what it would mean for grazing patterns and water rights and the cattle market, it was Wilhelmina who had prepared the careful analysis that let them decide confidently to stay where they were and consolidate rather than chase new land. Her analysis turned out to be correct, as most of her analyses did, and the ranchers who had talked themselves into chasing the Oklahoma land rush spent 2 hard years working out mistakes, while the Conroy operation ran steady and profitable. Thomas, at 9 years old, had a horse of his own, a steady-tempered young roan that he managed with a competence that made his father genuinely proud, and his father's hired hand slightly impressed, because the boy had a natural ease with animals that seemed to have come to him without instruction. He had also, in the spring of 1889, come to his mother with a concern about the ranch's fence posts in the north pasture. He had noticed, he said, that several of them had a particular lean to them that was different from the ordinary lean of an aged post, and he thought something was happening underground. She had gone out with him to look, and he had been right, a slow soil subsidence from an underground water channel shift, minor but worth addressing before it became significant. She had told him directly and without condescension that his observation was accurate and his conclusion sound, and had watched his face receive this with the particular expression of a child who has been taken seriously and knows it. Eliza, at 7, was reading with the intensity of someone who had found in books a parallel world that was as real to her as the ranch, and she had a habit of bringing what she read back to the kitchen table in the form of questions that sent her parents to find answers. She had also developed, to the gentle amusement of her family, the precise version of her mother's directness. She had told Burl Hicks, who had a habit of telling a particular story about his time in Texas with certain embellishments that grew each time, that the details were different this version than last time, which Burl had received with the mixture of embarrassment and helpless laughter that was the only reasonable response. Elias, at 42, ran the ranch with the accumulated authority of a man who had done this work for 20 years, and whose authority came not from volume or bluster, but from demonstrated correctness in every judgment that mattered. He treated his hands well, paid them fair wages, and expected in return honest work and honest communication, and he got both because people who worked for someone like that tended to rise to the expectation. Miguel Santos, who had ridden with him from Colorado, had by now his own small place adjacent to the Conroy property, bought over several years with careful savings, and he and Clara ran it together with the same practical competence they brought to everything. The 1890s arrived, and with them the full transformation of the cattle country that Elias had seen coming since he had stood at the North Fork Spring in October of 1878 and thought about what land would be worth in 20 years. The open range was gone, replaced by fenced operations and regulated water rights and the railroad economics that had finally replaced the trail drive entirely. The Conroy Ranch weathered this transition well, better than most. The documented water rights were gold. The fencing was good. The diversified herd strategy paid forward into the new market. Wilhelmina's accounts, now backed by years of careful records, gave them the historical data to make decisions that ranchers without her discipline of documentation could only guess at. In the summer of 1892, they sat on the porch again in the long summer evening, two people in their early 40s now with gray beginning at Elias' temples and a few threads of it in Wilhelmina's dark auburn hair, watching Thomas at 12 practice with a lasso in the yard, with the unself-conscious absorption of a boy who has found the thing he was made for. Eliza was on the porch steps with a book, reading in the last light, the green-gray eyes moving across the page with an attention that her father recognized as entirely his own. "I want to write down some of the account methods I have developed," Wilhelmina said, in the conversational tone of someone continuing a thought that had been going on for a while. "In a proper guide, not just for our records but for others to use. The methods are sound, and most small ranching operations in this county are working without them because no one has taken the time to put them in accessible form." He looked at her. She looked at him. She had been thinking about this for months, he could tell, and she had just decided it was fully formed enough to say. "You should do it," he said. "It will take time I could be using for other things." "It will take time that you will spend well," he said, "because you do not spend time any other way. Who do you intend to make it available to?" "Anyone who wants it," she said. "I thought the County Agricultural Extension Office, or I could have it printed. Either way." "Have it printed," he said. "That way it is accessible, and put your name on it." She looked at him. "You know what people will say about a woman writing a ranching accounts guide?" "I know what some people will say," he said. "I know what the people who actually use it and find it useful will say, which is that it is exactly what they needed. Your name goes on it." She smiled the rare full smile. "Yes," she said. "My name goes on it." It took her 2 years, worked on in the early mornings before the household woke and in the evenings after the children were in bed, and when it was finished, she had a guide to practical accounts management for small ranching operations in Kansas that was thorough, clear, and exactly what it claimed to be. She had it printed in Wichita through a printer who had published several practical agricultural guides, and it was distributed through the county extension office and sold in modest quantities through general stores across southern Kansas, including the Caldwell store now run by Carl Benson, who displayed it prominently and told every ranching customer they ought to have it. She received letters about it, which was something she had not fully anticipated, practical letters from ranching families, mostly women who managed their families' books, thanking her for putting in writing what they had been trying to work out on their own. She answered every letter directly and fully because it was her way and kept the correspondence in a box that she showed to no one until Eliza found it at 15 and read through it with her serious green eyes and looked up at her mother and said, "You helped a great many people." "I hope so," Wilhelmina said. "You did," Eliza said. "Look at this one." She held up a letter from a woman in Sedgwick County who had written that the guide had let her identify a year of underbilling from a supplier that she had then recovered, more than she had earned from 2 seasons of their small operation. "She says you saved her family's ranch." "The method saved it," Wilhelmina said. "She applied them." "You are as bad as father about deflecting credit," Eliza observed. Wilhelmina looked at her 15-year-old daughter in the afternoon light of the study and felt a full, complicated love that was one of the richest things in her life. "You are very direct," she said. "I learned it from you," Eliza said, and went back to reading the letter. In the autumn of 1897, Thomas Elias Conroy, at 17, was the kind of young man who made his parents proud in the specific way of watching someone they had raised become fully themselves. He worked the ranch with his father with a skill that had passed competence and arrived at something closer to vocation. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience and both their honesty, which Caldwell found alternately refreshing and bracing in a young person. He was courting, with cautious care, the daughter of the Henderson family on the neighboring 40 acres. A serious-minded girl named Ruth Henderson, who Wilhelmina had privately assessed and found to be exactly the right kind of person for her son, which she kept to herself because it was not her business unless she was asked. She was asked, eventually, by Thomas himself on a November evening when they were alone in the kitchen. He sat down across from her in the chair that had always been his father's chair, and looked at her with the green-gray eyes he had not in fact inherited but had somehow acquired by proximity, and said, "Mother, what do you honestly think of Ruth Henderson?" She looked at him for a moment. "I think she is exactly right for you," she said. "She is honest and she is kind and she works hard and she sees clearly. She will not agree with everything you say, which is what you need." "You have thought about this," he said. "I am your mother," she said. "I have thought about everything." He looked at her with a complicated expression that was gratitude and amusement and something tender underneath both of them. "Were you honest about things like this when you were 17?" he asked. "I was honest about things like this at every age," she said. "It was not always well received, but I am glad of it now." He nodded slowly. "I am going to ask her father," he said, "and then I am going to ask her." "Good," she said. "Come to it plainly and she will respect you for it." He stood up and then surprised her by bending down and pressing a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture of uncomplicated affection that she received with the particular warmth of a woman who has raised someone to give exactly this kind of affection at exactly the right moment. He went to find his father to have the other half of this conversation. Elias, when Thomas found him in the barn, listened to his son with the full attention he brought to every important conversation, and when Thomas was finished, looked at him for a long moment and said, "Go ask her honestly. You already know what you want. She likely already knows what she would say. Do not make either of you wait longer than necessary." Thomas went to ask Ruth Henderson's father the next day, and Ruth the following evening, and Ruth said yes immediately without a pause, because she was indeed exactly as honest and direct as Wilhelmina had assessed, and when a question has a clear answer, she saw no reason to obscure it. The wedding was set for the following spring, and the North Fork Ranch began to expand in its meaning to accommodate another generation beginning. By the first years of the new century, Wilhelmina and Elias Conroy were in their 50s, and the North Fork Ranch had the settled solidity of a place that has been properly loved and properly worked for 20 years. The fences were sound. The water rights were impeccably documented. The cattle operation ran with the competence of 3 generations of Conroy attention. Thomas and Ruth were building their own house on the East 40 and would take over the primary operation gradually and in full, because Thomas had been raised in the tradition of honest conversation, and there were no secrets between him and his father about the shape of that transition. Eliza had gone to study in Topeka, which had required a long kitchen table conversation about what the possibilities were and what she wanted them to be, and she had said directly that she wanted to study law, which was not a common ambition for a woman of 1900, and which her parents had considered in silence for exactly the length of time it took them to acknowledge that of course she would want to study law, and of course she should. She was studying now, with a tenacity that her professors noted in letters that Wilhelmina kept in a box alongside the letters from ranching families about the accounts guide. On an October morning in 1901, on the 23rd anniversary of the October Tuesday when Elias Conroy had stepped off the Wichita stage. Wilhelmina stood at the east window of their bedroom looking at the North Fork land in the early light. The cottonwoods were gold again, as they had been every October for 23 years, and the creek was silver in the morning sun, and the ranch was awake around her with all the sounds of a working morning. She heard Thomas's voice in the yard below, heard Ruth laughing at something, heard the particular cry of a baby that was the newest Conroy, 8-month-old James Thomas Conroy, who had arrived in February and who had his great-grandfather's name and his grandmother's auburn hair and both his parents' clear eyes. She heard Elias come up behind her and felt his hands on her shoulders and lean back against him the way she had been doing for 20 years, and they stood at the window together looking out at the land that was theirs, the land they had made into everything it was. 23 years, she said. Since I walked into your father's store, he said. You asked my opinion, she said, about 3 different land options. I meant to ask your father, he said. You were at the counter and you had such a definite look about you that I asked you instead. You have never told me that, she said. I meant to ask your father and I asked you, he said, because you looked like someone who would tell me the truth. She was quiet for a moment, watching the gold light move across the grass of the south pasture, watching young James's parents moving about the yard below with the easy competence of people who had grown fully into their lives. I sometimes think about those 3 men, she said, not with any grief. But I think about how it might have been. How it might have been, he said, is exactly as they made it a woman who deserved honesty in a town that did not have the sense to offer it. And then you arrived, she said. And then I arrived, he said, on a Tuesday. On a Tuesday, she confirmed, in a duster coat the color of dried clay. You remember the coat? I remember everything about that day, she said. I was reconciling the accounts when the bell rang. He turned her gently by the shoulders to face him, the way he had been turning her to face him for 23 years, and she looked at him in the October morning light, this man who was silver at the temples and lined at the eyes from decades of weather and outdoor work and laughter, who was exactly who he had been the first day she saw him and more besides, accumulated years of being exactly himself. And what she saw was what had always been there. Truth. His and hers held together all the way down. I love you, he said, not because of anything I expect you to be, because of everything you are. I know, she said, I love you the same way. He kissed her the way he had been kissing her for 23 years, unhurried and certain, and outside the window the October light fell across the North Fork land in long gold bars. The cottonwoods shook their brilliant leaves in the morning wind, and the Conroy Ranch stood in its full honest solidity under the enormous Kansas sky, built on the only foundation that ever held 2 people who had found in each other the extraordinary and undervalued thing of being told the truth, and had chosen it. Every single day, without exception. From the yard below came the sound of baby James beginning to fuss, and Ruth's voice low and soothing, and Thomas laughing at something, and Miguel and Clara arriving on horseback from their place next door for the Sunday that had replaced the old Hawkins Sunday dinners, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke coming from the kitchen downstairs, and Elias took her hand and they went down to the kitchen together, where everything was warm and loud and full of life. And the morning opened around them the way all their mornings had honestly and without pretense, and very, very well.